There it is, the thunderclap and the black lightning, and we are back. And if you heard that loud, crazy noise, that was the ice machine in the back kitchen of the bottom of the hill dumping a whole bunch of ice into the reservoir thing. So yeah, I probably should have turned all that stuff off. Nevertheless, here we are. And just as a reminder, for those of you who saw it, or as an announcement for those of you who didn't see it, several weeks back, I put up a video here in the Black Lightning series all about how what I think is the most underrated, underappreciated, or overlooked job in live sound is for people of almost every experience level, not just the folks who I aim these videos at, which is people starting out in bars and small clubs, but really a lot of people, intermediate and even slightly advanced level engineers, could benefit from doing an open mic. Open mics are a great experience for a lot of reasons. It definitely will hone your chops, and it is also a good way to network with musicians and meet a lot of people and start forming good relationships with people who are actually getting on a stage for the first time and they're really just getting started. And sometimes those will be relationships that you will end up having for many, many years. That can be a great thing. So I would say that right behind that, coming in a very close second place, would be church gigs or house of worship gigs. Even if, like myself, even if you don't consider yourself a religious or spiritual person, do not overlook the opportunity to work a church or house of worship gig. Those are great gigs for a lot of the same reasons as the open mics. Some of the same difficulties potentially as well, which is that, you know, they may not, depending on the gig, you know, maybe like some open mics are in really small places and they don't really have very much of a budget. And so you could be getting kind of underpaid, but I still think it's worth it to do it for a while, just because it can be such a fast learning curve and it can really help you a lot. And some churches want to run on volunteers, but maybe if you can show them the value of your work, maybe they can convince them at some point that it is worth getting paid. But even if you don't think that there's a lot of long-term potential in it, even if it seems like something that's not going to be financially a great gig for you, I still think it's massively important, good experience. There's a lot of great things that can come out of those gigs, and that one of them is that unlike mixing in bars and small clubs or working for production companies that are doing like live bands at events and that sort of thing, the whole thing about how even when the churches have musicians that you might be mixing for, there might be like a house band that plays, you know, some of the songs in the church. Ultimately, you're reprioritizing the way that you mix, and you're prioritizing everything up to be primarily about the spoken word. It doesn't really matter if you make the band sound really great. It's really important that people be able to hear very, very articulate vocals. And, you know, on the one hand, you could say, oh, well, you know, I work with all these like pop bands and it's really important to have vocals like up on top of the mix, and that's got to be like really articulate, legible vocals. Like that's always the thing that people want to hear on a pop mix or something. But it's really not the same when you're doing a church gig, because even when you eliminate all of the music and the music stops playing, you know, you might be in a situation like what I had done off and on at a place in Oakland for several years, is you might have a situation where the music stops and then at some point some announcements are made from a podium, and then somebody comes out to give a sermon, and the person doing the sermon might be the only live mic at that moment, but it's an omnidirectional lav mic, and they just decided out of the blue without announcing it that they're going to do some sort of impromptu interactive Q&A thing where they walk out into the middle of the room in the pews, and now suddenly they've got this wireless wonky sounding lav mic and they're standing out in front of the PA, and they don't have speakers that are well distributed. Everything's hung on the back wall, and they're driving all the volume to the back, you know, so again, it's all shooting right back into the mic in the middle of the room. Those things can be really, really good for training your ear and getting you really fast and efficient at eliminating feedback, and, you know, doing everything as carefully as possible, because there's still going to be a bunch of people sitting in the back rows who won't hesitate to come over to the booth and tell you that they can't hear what's going on or they don't understand the words that are being spoken. So it's really good in that regard. It's a steep, fast learning curve, very similar to the open mics, where at the open mics you're having different acts thrown at you like every 8 to 10 minutes with completely different instrumentation and completely different calibers of musicians. Thankfully, with most of the church gigs, you'll find that the musicians, the caliber of musicians, usually tends to be really, really good. I know a lot of like really, really good players who are full-time musicians, just like that's how they make their living, playing in various bands, and they all have church gigs as well, either because they get paid to do it or because they just really enjoy it and they're actual members of that particular church. But you do get to work with a lot of great players, so you will get to network with a lot of musicians, which is a good way to, again, end up getting future gigs through your network of people that you know. And ultimately, because it's not really intended to be a rock concert, I mean, depending on what church you're at, I mean, there might be some places that have like high volume stuff, but for the most part, most of the house of worship gigs that I've ever experienced, it's pretty easy on the ears. It's not like a really particular hard way to spend a Sunday morning. It's never terribly loud. Like I said, there might be issues with mitigating feedback and that sort of thing. But for the most part, it's pretty mellow and pretty easy on the ears. The one thing that's probably the biggest difficulty is if you're the typical person that watches this YouTube series and you are the person who's like starting out in bars and small clubs and you're like a beginner to intermediate level engineer, there's a really good chance that the majority of nights that you're working is, you know, on the weekends. So you're probably working on Saturday nights. So having a gig on Sunday morning that you'd be going to on maybe 4 or 5 hours of sleep might not be the most exciting idea for you right now. But those gigs are out there. I mean, I constantly on Craigslist in the Bay Area, on any given month, there's always a listing for some house of worship gig somewhere that needs a professional engineer. You know, again, I don't know what they'll all, you know, the pay rates could vary like pretty widely. But there are also some churches out there who take audio very, very seriously, and they make sure that they do budget for it. And I was fortunate that when I was working off and on for several years at the Oakland Center for Spiritual Living, that they actually did pay their engineers, and they paid like a decent, fair rate. And there was just a lot of really super cool people working there, even though, again, I'm not a religious person, and I wasn't somebody who like regularly attended that church or anything like that. But I met a lot of really, really great people through there. And again, some of those musicians later on turned out to be people that I start running into on my wedding gigs, because they play in wedding bands and they play in bands that get corporate bookings and that kind of stuff. And so they were people that I already knew from earlier years of doing stuff from around 2007 through about maybe 2011 or so over at the OCSL. So yeah, I think that is a highly, highly overlooked gig. I've tried to send a lot of friends over the years and colleagues and people that were kind of getting into the business, and or they were like, you know, had already been sound engineers and they moved to the Bay Area and they were looking for work out here. And many times I've sent people listings, I say, hey, did you see this ad on Craigslist? I'll send you the link and whatever. And a lot of times they sort of hedge or they hesitate and they go, I don't know, I'm not like a really religious guy. It's beside the point. You know, it doesn't really matter. They need a pro, they need somebody to step in and do it, and if you could be that person, you could learn a lot from it. So don't rule out the possibility of going out and getting a church gig. It's actually really, really valuable. So I hope that is helpful to you, and I will look forward to hearing from some of y'all in the comments on YouTube and Facebook and all the social media places. All right, talk to y'all later. Peace.